So remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord. As we go to the fourth commandment today, I want to talk to you about what should be the best day of the week. We call it the Sabbath. As Christians, we celebrate the Sabbath on Sunday. I know sometimes when I talk about the Sabbath in the past, people have said, well, in the Bible it's usually been Saturday that people have considered the Sabbath. But Paul writes in Corinthians that man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so the Lord. So Paul kind of seems to tell us it doesn't matter what day we pick. We need to pick one day and consider it special. Sunday has kind of been traditionally the day of the Sabbath, because that's when most Christians worship on Sunday morning. But as soon as I start talking about the Sabbath and keeping it holy, and we hear the verses about not doing any work, someone will say, well, some days I have to work on a Saturday, where my job will call and say, I've got to work today, or my schedule will say, I've got to work a few Sundays in a row. So how can I keep the Sabbath if I've got to work? It's not so much about keeping a specific day of the week. The Sabbath is about finding a day when we can treat it differently than any other day. God is serious about the Sabbath. If you look closely at the words, you see that the Sabbath is a day to the Lord, your God. The Sabbath is a day for the Lord, a day to the Lord, our God. The fact of the matter is that if the Sabbath isn't dedicated to God, you're not obeying this commandment, and you're not enjoying it as you should. If God is not central in what you do on Sundays, you're in violation of His commandment. While it's made for us, we're receiving no lasting benefit if it's not a Sabbath to the Lord. When I read those couple sentences, when I thought about them, I never thought of Sunday that way. I thought of Sunday usually as you get up in the morning, you go to Sunday school or church for an hour or two, and then you watch football in the afternoon. You mow your lawn. Maybe you finish up a few house projects around the house. Maybe you scramble and get some work done that you knew you had to do before Monday starts. But what about that makes God central in our lives? Well, when we look at the Sabbath, it's not that we have to worship God all day long. But the Sabbath is meant to be different. Like I said, Sunday has kind of been the traditional day when we've considered it Sabbath, because that's when church is. But some can't observe that on a Sunday because work schedules or something happens. The Sabbath is about picking a day that's different than all of your other days during the week. But it's important to God that we find a day of the week to Sabbath, to rest. If I counted correctly in Hebrew, there are 41 words to this commandment. The sixth commandment has 2 words, the seventh commandment had 2 words, the eighth commandment has 2 words. So that means that God has spent more ink reminding us about the Sabbath than He did on murder, adultery, and stealing. Now, just because there's more words in this commandment doesn't mean it's more important. But remembering the Sabbath has more importance than I think we usually give it. So what is the Sabbath for anyway? What's the purpose of the Sabbath? Well, first of all, the Sabbath is something in a time when to focus on God and relationships. An easy way to do that is to worship in church on Sunday morning. The Sabbath is also to be enjoyed. In Jesus' day, we hear a couple arguments that He has with Pharisees, because it's the Sabbath and they're walking, and they'll be walking through the fields and they'll pluck some grain to eat. And the Pharisees or the Sanhedrin will pounce on them and say, you're working on the Sabbath, you can't do that. And Jesus' response is, we've got to eat. Even King David ate of the sacred bread in the temple when him and his men were starving. Another time, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. A man approaches him with a withered hand and demands to be healed. And of course Jesus heals him on the Sabbath. But the Pharisees and the others say, "You're working on the Sabbath. You can't do that." They had boiled the Sabbath down to something you had to endure. There were laws literally about how many steps you could take in a day. Because if you took more than 10 steps, you were working. You were doing too much, what they meant to the Sabbath. Well, there's no enjoyment in counting your steps for the day to make sure you're honoring the Sabbath. And that's not what God means by the Sabbath. It's not something we're supposed to just tolerate. It's not some obligation that we have to fulfill. It's something that we need to enjoy. It's a blessing. It's a time when we can just relax. It's a day that should be different than the rest of the days of the week. But we have a hard time relaxing and doing nothing. I shouldn't even say doing nothing. We have a hard time relaxing and doing something fun. Because there is so much that we have to do. I remember growing up on the farm with my dad. And if it was harvest or it was planting season, you plant or you harvest no matter what day it is. And my dad did that growing up. If it's good weather, doesn't matter if it's Sunday or Saturday or what, you got to get the planting done. And I remember we talked to him about that once, and he said that his dad, and then my grandpa, and then my great-grandpa, they would never plant or they would never harvest on Sunday. Didn't matter what was going on, how much they could do it, they never did it on Sunday, because my grandpa always said he'd always break down on Monday anyway if he was planting on Sunday. But they knew it was a day to be set aside as different. And I can't stand up here and say, you should never plant or harvest on a Sunday. But I thought that was interesting that my great-grandfather and my grandfather, for so many years, planted, farmed, never did anything on Sunday and seemed to get things in and out. Well, yet my dad felt important to do so, right or wrong. But I bring up that example to teach us there are all kinds of things that can get in the way of our Sabbath. I've got to get this project done. I've been meaning to do this around the house. This is the only day I have a chance to do it. I couldn't get all my work done for the week. I've got to do it on a Sabbath. I've got to do it. I can't relax. I can't slow down. You sit down and do nothing for a little bit. You sit down just to spend time playing games with the family. And sometimes even guilt creeps in to say, oh, I should be doing this or I should be doing that. There's this to be done. There's that to be done. But the Sabbath is a day to be different. We have 6 days to do what we do for a living and work. But the Sabbath should be a day set apart. A day to take time out from your work and enjoy special blessings. A special day. A different day. So how do we keep the Sabbath? How do we make sure the Sabbath stays holy for us? Well, the word holy carries with the idea of purity and distinction. So we're supposed to keep the Sabbath pure and distinct from other days. One thing we should be able to do is find a day to take a break from all the hard work we do during the week. I talked about in the children's sermon, we have batteries that need to be recharged. We all know how we feel if we end up working for days or weeks even in a row without much of a break. Even the most hardy of us are going to get tired and need a break. Or if you don't, production's going to fall, you're not going to be able to work as hard, you're going to make mistakes. There's only so long you can keep it up before your body eventually says, I have to stop. We had a neighbor who would work every spring and every harvest. You could almost pick the day when he would get really sick and be laid up for about a week. You could almost count on it for when he would start in the spring or when he would start in the fall, because he would work himself so hard every day that eventually his body said, you got to stop, you're killing me. And he would get sick, and it would be either a flu or some kind of illness that would just shut him down for a week. He couldn't get himself out of bed, where his body said, I've got to stop. Hopefully, we're smarter than that we know that there are limits when we need to stop or charge. But that reminds us that we need time down to recharge our batteries, to rest. And that's part of what the Sabbath is. God knows we need time to just relax and unwind too. Take a break from our work. Now, does that mean we find our easy chair at home and we sit there for the entire day and do nothing? Not necessarily. That may be part of the day. Relaxing, watching something on television, even a football game can be considered part of your Sabbath. Reading a book, taking a walk with your family, playing games with friends, playing games with your family, by baking something you really enjoy, sharing something special with your children. A day to do something different, to enjoy family or friends. A day also to do good for others. There are a few places in Scripture that you can see where Jesus was really angry. And one of them was in Mark. Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal them on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and said, and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Imagine your neighbor calls you and says, "I've got a clogged pipe in my house. I can't figure out how to fix it." Is your response going to be, "I can't help you today. It's my Sabbath. I can't get out of my easy chair this morning or this afternoon. I've got to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy"? No. You're going to go help your neighbor. You're going to do something good. You're going to help somebody out, just as Jesus did in healing that withered man's hand. Keeping the Sabbath holy, keeping it pure and distinct, doesn't mean we just sit around and do nothing. It means we make it a special day of the week, not just an any other day of the week. Another way to keep the Sabbath is by worshiping God. Worshiping God is our highest calling. It's the primary purpose of why we were made. John Piper says, "God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him." What that means is that when we separate ourselves from the mundane things of life and seek our satisfaction in God, He is glorified, and we are satisfied. Now, I've heard all kinds of stories about, well, I can worship God anywhere. Generally, people don't. I've heard people say, Sunday mornings, I can worship God just as good on a golf course as I can in church. Sure you can. Or I've heard people say, I've got to go and do this on Sunday mornings. I can worship God on my way there or on the way back. Sure you can. We know how it isn't. We don't. Sunday morning, church is a time when we can gather with like-minded people and focus our attention on God, if only for an hour. A way to remind us that there's something bigger, a relationship out there we should be seeking and nourishing. So today, we should ask ourselves two things. How are we observing the Sabbath? Are we keeping it separate from Monday through Friday? Is it any different than Saturday? Are we doing more God things than spending an hour or two in church? Are we doing good on the Sabbath? Or are we doing things that feel like work? Are we doing things that are commonplace and mundane? And the second question is, we need to ask ourselves if we're doing something that opens our eyes, heart, and mind to the goodness of God on this Sabbath. By taking a walk, calling a friend we haven't talked to for a long time on the phone, making something nice for a family member or a friend, by worshiping God on that Sabbath. As I said in the beginning, we don't have to set up all kinds of rules to worship and make the Sabbath holy. There are some Sundays where you have to do something else, and you can't make that Sabbath special. Life comes up. That happens. But if that becomes an every week occurrence, and we forget a Sabbath, or a day to rest, a day to worship, a day to make it special, a day to enjoy God's blessings, then we run the risk of our batteries being drained down too. And our relationship with God and with others will suffer because we lose that connection. We lose that time to rest and experience God. That's what the Sabbath is about. Finding time throughout the week. Finding a day when we know we can make it special by doing something with family, doing something for ourselves, or maybe just doing nothing for the afternoon, where we can just rest and recharge. But the Sabbath is a time when we can connect, rejuvenate, recharge, find ways that make it happen for us, and we will enjoy the blessings of the Sabbath. Amen. Let's stand and say together our hymn of reflection, found on page 5.